I'm Kate DeBartolo, by the way, Senior Director of the Conversation Project. I happen to live in Washington, D.C., so this was a nice, easy reverse commute for me this morning. And I'm going to share with you a little bit more about what the Conversation Project has, how it can be useful to you, and then a lot of the tips we've learned over time, especially around messaging and types of issues that have come up. The Conversation Project is generally a large public engagement initiative with the goal to help people have conversations about their wishes for care through the end of life, so those wishes can be understood and respected. We have no preference for the type of care people can have. We want these conversations to happen early, often, not in an ICU. You know, like we know that a crisis is a really hard time to learn. And so if we can bring these more around the kitchen table or where people feel comfortable, that's what we're going for. No preference for the kind of care people can have, and we joke that we should have been the Conversations Project because we know that this often happens over multiple conversations. It's not one big hunky-dory, sit down, talk about it once, and the whole thing is over. And for us, I want to name, I'm not an attorney. I think the legal documents are really important, and we're really about conversations because we have found that it doesn't do much good if somebody says, as my mother-in-law did, oh yes, I did this, I filled out a form one time, I had shoulder surgery 13 years ago, I gave that to my doctor, I'm sure they have it on file, and you could access it. And I'm thinking, I'm sure they don't have it on file. I would imagine your wishes have changed, and I don't know how we could ever get that. Or people who say it's in a safety deposit box, or you find out after it was in some manila folder or in a dresser drawer, so technically people thought I took care of this with the lawyer, but they never told anybody about it. And so we want to normalize talking about this early and often so that it doesn't feel as hard when the time comes. It's like a muscle that if the more we use it and flex it, when we really need to use it, it's not our first time. That's the goal. And to also name that we know talking about it doesn't guarantee things will go a particular way. This reminds me of having a child and being asked to create a birth plan where I was invited to think about what would success look like. And medically, that may or may not be what we can do, but the providers wanted to know about what mattered to me. The same thing, that was kind of like birth is not just a medical experience, it's a human experience, and the same thing is true for death and the end of life. And so for us, we're trying to shift away from a focus just on the death and dying and more to how somebody is living their life through the end. Somebody did an interview and asked me, well, what if somebody has this kind of cancer and they're dying over the course of 18 months? And I would say they are living for those 18 months. The dying is the last part of it, and we can really focus on how somebody wants to live their life. That it's this shift away from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. And a lot of providers focus on what the diagnosis is and what's the matter with this patient and not what matters to them. And this is not only applicable at the end of life, this should be true at all stages that we're focused on what matters most to someone. That it's moving away from focusing on clinical things and more about values that people would have. And that in any good conversation, it's not just about telling people what we think they should do or what would I do in your situation. It's really trying to listen to what they're telling us. And I love this quote about how it's often through the quality of our listening and not the wisdom of our own words that we're able to have a more profound changes on people around us. Atul Gawande is a physician who's written a lot of great books and stories, and he has this book a quote from his book, In Being Mortal, that our ultimate goal, after all, is not a good death, but a good life to the very end. And that has really resonated with me. I'm drawn to this work not only for the person whose end of life we may be discussing, but also for the people around them and the survivors afterwards, and how after the loss of somebody, especially if it's somebody that they cared for, we'll talk about that later, not everybody's a loved one in this situation, but especially if you are grieving the loss of someone, how to help that grief not be complex and complicated because you're no longer talking to your sibling or you're second guessing whether or not you did the right thing because mom never told you about that there's a real profound effect that this can have on other people as well by having these conversations. And so those are the stories that always get me excited to hear from people who, even though they may have a hard time with the loss of their person, it wasn't a harder experience for them to go through. So we have a website, theconversationproject.org, where at first we said, let's put out some resources, make this easier for people. And I should mention, I'll be happy to have these slides go out to everybody afterwards. And we started to have people share their stories with us, and they were everything from really thoughtful, I have these conversations because I'm a father and I did this at Father's Day to be sure my family's taken care of, to somebody who's like, hey guys, could you trim my chin hairs if I'm ever in a situation where I can't be doing that, because I really would like you to know that about me. There's a wide range of how people approach this. It has been fun to see, not trying to make light of a hard topic, but to make it a little more lighthearted, to hear how like the Onion, the online satirical magazine, had a piece of like, new study shows death rate holds steady at 100%. Or a pastor who was doing a sermon with us and said, everybody wants to get to heaven, but nobody wants to die to get there. We got to be willing to talk about this, and let's find readings in our denomination that can make this more accessible for people. So we've learned that it's not just us telling people to do it, it's storytelling and people sharing and trying to identify many types of storytellers and many types of experiences to share how this has played out for them. I feel like LeVar Burton in Reading Rainbow, of like, don't take my word for it, here's other people and how we can highlight their wishes. We have a lot of free conversation starter guides that look like this. You have one of them printed in your handouts from today. The main things to know is they're available, so they're free. I want to say that like 12 times. They're free, they're available in English, Spanish, and Chinese. We're having Portuguese coming this summer. And they have a Creative Commons license on them, which means you can adapt them however you want. You can pop your own logo on it. You can change the font. You can change the colors. There's a health system in Colorado that's like, if I can change the font and the colors, we'll get this out to 1,000 patients and we'll pop our logo on it also, and then we can get it out. There's been clergy who say, I'd like to ask a question about something, or a financial planner who wants to add a different question. You are welcome to do that. You can snip out questions, pop them on your website. This is really meant to be for common use and good. But we started with a conversation starter guide. Okay, I know I'm supposed to do it. What am I going to talk about? And I'll walk you through that. But pretty quickly, people said, well, how do I choose a healthcare proxy? Or I think in Maryland, you say agent. Somebody asked me to be their healthcare agent. How do I do that? I'm a caregiver for somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia, or a seriously ill child. So we started to create additional guides based on what the field was telling us they needed. So one of my asks for you is, if you feel like there's something that's missing, please let us know. We have one that we did with Ariadne Labs on the right. It's more of a workbook for living with serious illness. It never mentions end of life, because we know for some people, if they were to see death or end of life written, they'd say, oh, thank you very much, this isn't for me, even if they're living with a very serious illness. And so it's a book about living well with your serious illness, and it asks similar questions, but with slightly different phrasing. And we're also working on a new tool this summer, part of our age-friendly health system work. It's for older adults, focusing on how to prepare for appointments and to think about what matters most, your mobility, your medications, your mind. So really open to feedback on languages that would be helpful, how you would want to use this. So when we first started, we said, okay, good, we're going to try to normalize this. We're going to have some tools available. And very quickly, different community groups started to say, can I bring this to Boulder, Colorado? We've done a lot of work in Howard County with the Horizon Foundation and the congregations here, as well as some of the health systems. All you can see from a Zoom call, like people putting their pins on a map where they were. Some of those are retired ICU nurses who said, my encore career, I saw this my whole professional life, I got to get the word out to people. I'm going to do events at my local library. I want to do something with a book group. Others are entire state hospital associations saying, let's help make people familiar with this. But really trying to reach people where they live, work, pray, and learn. Because, as mentioned, of this not just being a medical experience, there are a lot of people for whom the healthcare system is not their most trusted partner in the community, and that is not the person to hear this message from, or it would imply really bad news. What are you telling me, doc? Are you trying to tell me something? But if they hear this in the local newspaper because somebody writes an article, and then they hear about it at church, and then they hear about it from a friend, that's going to make it that much more palatable and willing to take it on. So it's been neat to see employers say, we have our employees or caregivers when they go home, we can help them with this. I remember a health system in Memphis, they said, we got 10,000 hospital employees in this city. If each of us went and had the conversation with somebody in our lives here, we could be the ones who help snowball this and normalize it within our community. So today, again, that idea of take off your professional hat for a minute and just be in the room as whoever you are, as I walk you through some of the prompts that we have. So in our guides, we'll open up with some open-ended questions. What matters to me through the end of my life is, fill in the blanks. And people will share everything from kind of more somber or serious to like, I want to listen to 90s music, or I really hate having my sheets tucked in around my feet. And if you think that you're making me cozy and I can't speak for myself and you keep tucking my sheets in, that's not appreciated. Thank you very much. But what we found is the larger the phrase when it shows up here, it was shared more commonly. And you'll notice that very few of these answers are clinical in nature about what matters most to somebody. This is more about their values and how they hope to be at the end of their life. And another way to help people talk about this is to provide some scale questions. People can often identify themselves on a scale. Are you concerned about not getting enough care or receiving too much care? People fall on different ends of that spectrum for totally different reasons, and that's a helpful thing to talk about. I have a friend whose parents are on the exact opposite ends of the spectrum. The dad is like looking into getting himself cryogenically frozen. He says, if I'm blinking, I'm in there trying to come out. Maybe medicine and technology will change, so do everything you can. And the mom is that retired ICU nurse who says, thank you very much, I'm good to go, you do not need to do anything. They are not each other's healthcare proxy, but it is also given their children a helpful understanding of where people are along this spectrum. So we try to offer a couple of different prompts about the kind of care you would want. Do you want people to do exactly what you said no matter what, or what makes them feel comfortable when the time comes? People can share what their wishes are there. And then we try to help people say, who are you going to talk to? When are you going to do it? What are you going to say? It always seems too soon until it's too late. So really trying to help people get specific about what the plan is. There was a woman in Akron, Ohio, who was at an event like this, and she said that she hosts Thanksgiving every year, and she held all of the desserts hostage one year and said, no pumpkin pie till you tell me how you want to die, and made everybody go around the table and answer the question. And that worked in her family, and it did not work for other people. Like, that would not be an appropriate way to bring it up for other people. And so this is also a helpful time to think about what are the family norms or the social norms or the cultural norms that you need to take into think about before introducing this concept. And I'll just share that when I travel all over the country with this, and I'll talk to people who say, in my culture, it is taboo to talk about this, or in my religion, or in my community, it's not appropriate. And that's unique, and how would I do that? And I would say it's actually not that unique, because most cultures don't want to talk about this, or that's the rationale. And yet many also have a culture of honor and respect and caring for your elders, or the framing and the way it is introduced can make it much more palatable. And again, this idea of how you want to live your life and how can I understand what matters most to you so I can honor that and be sure I'm doing right by you is a lot easier than let me invite in this conversation about how you want to die. We believe that these conversations should be happening early and often. 18, 21, somebody's moving out of the house. A parent isn't an automatic decision maker anymore. This should be normalized. You're heading out. This is what we do as adults who are taking care of our life things. We've seen colleges take this on. It's actually been very well received by young adults. They can say, I expect natural disasters, terrorist activity. I love mountain biking. Risk is a part of my life. Maybe they're not acknowledging mortality, but they can see a scenario where maybe there's a time I can't speak for myself. Who would I trust to speak for me? What do I want them to know? That approach of early on, it can be about who would you want as your healthcare proxy. We also see a lot of young adults skipping a generation and really stepping in with grandparents and saying wait a minute, this is not what grandpa would have liked. Aunties, uncles, what are you doing? This is not, I got to stop the line here and call you out on this. We think it's important before a crisis, so whether that's every decade or you guys have coming up April 16th is National Healthcare Decisions Day. It was set for April 16th due to a Benjamin Franklin quote that nothing is certain in life but death and taxes. So you get your taxes done on the 15th, and every year on the 16th you just make sure, is everything still in line the same way that you would want? It's a natural excuse to bring it up with people who might be wondering, why are you telling me this now? It's it's just this big national thing, that's why I'm doing it. Super important with different life events. I had this conversation with my husband when we got married, had it again having a child. I know among friends or family with divorce or a death in a family or a dementia diagnosis, maybe that person isn't who you want to be your healthcare decision maker anymore. So there's different prompts that you can use as an excuse that have nothing to do with illness. Major trips, this one, I'll throw my dad under the bus on this one, but he went on a 5-week-long cross-country motorcycle trip, one of his many motorcycle midlife crises that we've had in our life. And we had a conversation about what would you want if you get into a bike accident halfway across the country. That's a little bit different, and his answers were different for that versus regular life. If somebody's traveling somewhere far away, what's the plan? What do you need us to know? And certainly if diagnosed with a new serious illness and there's a little more sense of what the trajectory could be, that's another good time. So that idea that it always seems too soon until it's too late, and so having multiple points where this is just normalized to bring it up can be really helpful. And then we offer icebreakers for people. We talked about this idea, like, can you help me with something? Asking an adult parent, like, can you help me with something? They're often eager to help their child. Or that idea of honor and respect. I was thinking about what happened to Uncle Tony, and it made me realize I'm not sure if that's what you would want, or like something that's happening presently in the family, and that's a way to bring it up. Maybe a TV show like This Is Us just had a big series finale where there's a lot of these conversations. Movies that are occurring where it gives you the excuse to say, I was watching that, or I read this. We've actually seen the Screenwriters Guilds getting much more interested in talking to people about accurate depictions of end-of-life issues. It used to be in the TV show ER and House. Somebody would have CPR and they would bounce back perfectly, like 90% of the time, and it was not an accurate depiction of what these things were like, and it's gotten, I would say, much better and continues to get better. And then you all had the best excuse of all. Like, I was at this event, I heard about the Conversation Project, they made me realize I hadn't told you what I was thinking about, or I want to make sure I know what you want. So using any of those types of excuses to break the ice can be helpful. And then there's some things that we've seen, and I want to just share some of those stories with you about some of these big areas. So the first is this role that somebody may want to have. And you'll have to forgive me that I'm on my 4th round of this, so I can't remember if we've talked about autonomy yet. But this idea that culturally autonomy is or isn't an important thing for different people. There are some people who may feel very much like, I want you to do exactly what I've said, no matter what. We have this woman, Katie Butler, who wrote she's an author, she wrote a book, and she wrote a blog post that's like 20 bullet points of, if I have dementia, I would like you to follow every single one of these things that I've said. And yet at a different event, there was a woman in Las Vegas who was going through our things, and she was like, I don't actually care about any of this. I've looked at your questions, I don't really care, I just want my kids to do what makes them feel good at the time. So that's the conversation she should have, is I want you two to be on the same page. I don't have very strong preferences, because otherwise her kids just think, I don't know, mom didn't tell us, maybe they disagree about what happens next. So thinking about that role of autonomy. In the last session, somebody's like, in my culture, it's the oldest child. Like, that is very much, we can't break that cultural norm. That's important to know and to lean into and figure out who are you going to engage. Then thinking about the type of care somebody may want and giving current answers. That's what I would suggest. Too many people try to think of all the hypothetical scenarios that could play out. I don't know if I'm going to have cancer. I don't know if I'm going to be hit by a bus. I don't know if there's going to be fire. We can't talk about every hypothetical scenario. You can talk about what you would want right now. So I did this with my husband when we got married, and he answered every question as if he were 85 years old with Alzheimer's in a nursing home. And I said, we have time to get to that scenario. I need to know what you would want right now if something unexpected happened to you. And then again, we can revisit this if other life things happen. So encouraging people to think about their current body and state of mind. The concept of home comes up a lot. A lot of people say they want to die at home, or never put me into a nursing home, or whatever that may be, and really trying to unpack that one. I remember a woman at an event like this who was in tears saying, the only thing my grandmother said is she wanted to die at home, and we couldn't do it. Her Alzheimer's got so hard to manage that we had to move her, and I feel like I didn't honor her one request. And so I would say sometimes it's not medically feasible, sometimes it's not financially feasible. Somebody in Manhattan was like, I'm on a 5th floor walk-up. This is not physically feasible to be at home. And yet, is it that somebody wants a private room? They want their artwork on the walls. They want to be sure there's visitors. For my grandmother, it was 100% about her cat. Like, if she could have her cat with her, she was willing to go anywhere, and she was also not willing to go anywhere at all unless the cat was a package deal. So that's helpful to find out what does somebody mean by home. If anybody ever says, if I get like that, pull the plug or give me the whole enchilada, trying to understand a little bit more, that usually would imply they feel pretty strongly on one end of the spectrum or not. There was a gentleman at an event in California whose parents had both had pretty severe dementia, and he was like, my family knows exactly what I want. We're gonna have a big party at the beach, and then I'm gonna swim to China, and if I don't make it, oh well. And he was so pleased with himself, and his wife was rolling her eyes, like, can you believe this man? That's all he ever talks about is this party on the beach, and he won't get serious, and I have real questions. And it was like, he clearly feels pretty strongly about something. How can we try to unpack what that is? And I have a colleague who has a great line that I think is probably my answer. I've talked about this with my husband, and she has it down to one sentence, really, for her husband and decision maker. She's in good shape right now. They've got 2 teenage kids. And she said, if something happens and I can still intellectually and emotionally parent our children, I'm in. I don't care about the pain that I would have to suffer. I don't care about the physical limitations that I may have. Like, I would want you to do everything you can to save my life and allow me to participate in their lives that way. But if the prognosis is such that I'm not going to be able to communicate with them, I can't understand what's going on, I do not need you to take such extreme measures to keep me going. Her husband now has a pretty good frame to base any questions off of or to help answer if a clinician has a question about what do we want to do in this situation. In Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, there's the example of, if I can eat chocolate ice cream and watch college football, that's good. I'd like to keep going. That's life worth living for me. For some people, that wouldn't be enough. For some people, that would be plenty. And so that's what we mean about talking about values and not all the hypothetical medical scenarios. It did get chilly, right? It was like 100 degrees. Now it's cold. Woo. The next thing is to think about the role that others will play. And this idea of, can you choose a proxy who will honor your wishes? So there was a woman in Hawaii who was trying to do this proactively. She was in good health. She met with her husband, who he was listening to her wishes, and he was just like, I cannot handle that. I will hang on to a green plant with one single green leaf left on it. I would sit by your side holding your hand in a vegetative state for 20 years. Like, please don't put that on me. So she went to her son, who was like, yeah, I get it. You don't want to be hooked up to a machine ever. You're good to go. Like, you're done. She was like, nope, I didn't say that one either. Her middle child couldn't get through the conversation without sobbing the entire time. And she went to her youngest daughter, who I think was 24. Now it's like the 4th pick, who really listened to what she had to say and understood that depending on prognosis, you'd be willing to do these things. It's like, ding, 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 you get the job because you are actually listening to me and you'd be able to do it. So it's important to help people realize it does not have to be a spouse. It does not have to be the oldest child. I remember a woman in St. Louis who was 26. She had done this. She had chosen her mom. And she was like, I now realize that if something happens to me, it's a pretty catastrophic event that's going to be the worst thing in my mother's life. And I'm not sure I want her to be in that position. I would like to just let her sit by my side and grieve. And I'm going to ask my cousin to do this right now because I don't want my mom to be in that position. So really helping people think they don't have to choose somebody because of certain expectations. And then the same thing is true, we've seen, especially in a growing population of solo agers, people who feel they don't have somebody naturally. I was at an event in the Collington area a couple months ago, and a woman came and she was like, I am a solo ager. My husband recently died. We have no children. I have a fairly distant niece who I've put in this role. But actually, my neighbor here and I get along super well. We've gone on a cruise together. I feel like she would get me like, am I allowed to choose a friend? And she was just looking for permission of like, yes, you can pick the person who knows you best and could understand what your wishes are. This also gets to the idea of loved ones, and that some people have to play this role for somebody they don't have much love for, or they don't have as good of a relationship with. I would say with solo agers, it's all the more reason to document somebody's wishes. If you don't feel like there's as many people to speak up for you, make sure your doctors have this on file. And then the same thing would be true if there's somebody, or there's a family dynamic at play where there are people you do not want involved in your care. all the more reason to make sure that is known and on file. We've seen that especially in the LGBTQ plus community of people who may feel like some of the members of my family of origin are not respectful of my wishes or my family, my spouse, and I do not want them involved in this. Let's make sure that that is made clear. It's really important to tell more than one person. So there was an event where a woman came to me and said, I'm my husband's decision maker. We've done this. We've had the whole conversation. But I'm his second wife, and his adult children don't know that he picked me. And I'm now realizing that's going to cause World War III. But all he has to do is it'll be okay if they know ahead of time. So all he has to do is say, hey, kids, like I've been talking with Barbara. We've got a plan. That happened with my mom. She was one of 7 kids. She was the healthcare decision maker, and the other 6 got it. They knew that. It wasn't a lot of fighting amongst people. So even if you do this, making sure that other people know about it, that can even just be an email that goes out and says, hey, everybody, I want you to know I talked to Tommy. He's on board. We've got a plan. There was a woman at an event who referred to her husband as Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, that he's kind of mopey about this whole topic, and he didn't want to talk about it at all, but she was feeling really nervous that they hadn't talked about it more formally. And she phrased her questions as yes-no answers of, is it right to assume, or would you, I'm assuming that you would like me to be the person who helps make decisions if you can't speak for yourself. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, good. I'll work on that. I'll get that taken care of. This is what I think you would want if you couldn't speak for yourself. Does that sound right to you? Yeah. But here's one thing to know. And he was willing to not sit down and pore over dozens of questions and let's talk about lots of things, but he was willing to get to the nitty-gritty on it. And then to just be careful about avoiding scenarios of family or caregiver bullying. Maybe bullying is too hard of a term, but there was an event with maybe 250 people in a room. A woman got up in tears in front of the entire crowd and said, I realize I owe my father a tremendous apology because he's really sick right now. His breathing got bad last night, and he wouldn't go to the hospital. And my siblings and I have been laying it on so thick for him. We've been calling him, texting him, sending him videos of his grandchildren saying, we need you to be here. And I realize he's trying to tell us something. And we're not listening because there's something going on for him, and we've just been pushing him with what we want. And I've already sent a text message, and we're going to have a family meeting this afternoon. And so just watching out for that, I think, can be really important. I think this idea, too, of hope and miracles comes up a lot, how to continue to have hope with somebody. If they're praying for a miracle, they're praying for a cure, and how to not abandon somebody in that hope, and to be hoping in the beginning. I love this quote of early on, we hope for a cure. And then if that's not the case, that if that's impossible, we hope for as much good time as possible. And then after that, we can really hope for relief from suffering and kind of death with dignity. And to be alongside somebody in their hope while also acknowledging that mortality piece. I loved this framing from Dr. Sunita Puri of, especially for somebody who says, I want to do everything. Give me everything you got. Part of doing everything for you is knowing what you'd want if there's a time where you couldn't speak for yourself. Like, would you be willing to talk to me about that? And what does doing everything look like for you? It is only in the last few decades that science and technology have gotten so advanced that we even can question what we might do. If you had a stroke 60 years ago, there were not the same options that we have now. And so that's one reason why we're kind of catching up on this with healthcare and having these conversations, because it didn't used to be on the individuals to decide what steps I want taken now. So let me understand, what does doing everything mean for you? What are you fighting for? There was a gentleman in the Boston area in his 90s. He was very clear with his doctor. He had a lot of health issues. I do not want extreme measures taken. He had all of his documents in place. And yet he was admitted to the ICU with a full code status, and his doctor was rounding and was just like, what's going on, Mr. Brown? I thought we had a plan. And he said, yes, but my first great-grandchild is due in 2 weeks, and I will do anything I can to meet that baby, and then we can go back to the other plan. And that's an example that's so helpful for the providers to know, like, what matters to you, what are you fighting for? If there's a wedding in 2 months, what are we dealing with here? And then similarly to acknowledge and give openings to people who maybe have been in that give me everything mode, and they want somebody to give them permission to change that, of like, how are things going? How's surgery been for you? How's that recovery been for you? And giving people a chance to explain how they're feeling. I really appreciated this idea of the difference between giving up and shifting that more towards letting go, and that putting the onus on the body as opposed to an individual. So this idea of your father is a strong man. He's giving it everything he's got, but his body is really struggling, or his body is having a hard time. And it's not that your dad is giving up on you, it's about the body, and that has often made it, the communication a little bit easier for people. So speaking of communication, we've done work as part of the Massachusetts Coalition for Serious Illness Care did some really cool messaging research. It's national in nature, but they were looking at the reasons why people do or don't have these conversations around end-of-life care wishes and trying to figure out what messaging works for everyone. And on the left, you'll see in that kind of peachy color, people who take action, but they actually take action for totally opposite reasons. Some of them are really worried and anxious. Maybe they've been a caregiver role before, they've been through this, they've seen how things go, so that they approach it from a place of anxiety, whereas other people approach it from a position of self-assuredness. I feel confident saying what my wishes are, I expect that people will listen to that. Those are two very different reasons why they take action, and similarly, reasons why people don't take action. Some people have had a really bad experience with the healthcare system, or trusting the healthcare system did not honor a person in their life's wishes in the past, so why would I do this? Or, I don't need to talk about this, my family knows what I want, I don't need to bother them with it now. Those are two very different reasons for not taking action. And so they took a look at what types of messaging work for people across all of those segments. And so the larger the circle, the more it resonated, and the blue-green color is good. And so the two that really worked for everybody is this idea of gaining control. In a time where things may feel out of control, this is a way to have some control. You've made other major decisions in your life, here's another one. And even if you think people know what you want, conversations clarify. This is a chance to gain that control. And similarly to demand shared decision-making, the idea that you can have a say in your care, for a lot of people, that's news to them. There's a lot of deferential to the healthcare system. I'm just going to listen to what the doctors and nurses have to say, and the fact that you can have a say, and your providers want to know what matters to you because they can make better recommendations on that. And then some of the messages, we used to do these ones on the right. So I just want to name, if you're going back and you're looking at your websites or your brochures, and you're like, we talk about alleviating the burden or giving the gift of conversation. Like I did the exact same thing, and yet we have learned now other language to use going forward. Similarly, we've learned that it's not helpful to do myth busting in this space. You think of this example from the NIH where they talk about like, what is palliative care? Like, it's not hospice and end of life, but people actually anchor towards the myth, and they get confused about what's the word that you're trying to tell me, and that it is much more effective to just tell people what something is. And so we're part of this group. There's a website called the seriousillnessmessaging.org, where there's language you can use, there's imagery that you can use, and you can steal the messages for your own programming. And so this idea of advanced care planning, you can have a say in your care. Treatments only work if they work for you. We'll figure this out together. Here's what it is and what we are offering. Similarly, for palliative care, an added layer of support. You can live well while living with heart failure at any stage of serious illness. We're here for you. This is describing what it is like to receive palliative care, what you could expect from having it, and it's not anchoring people to something that it is not. And same thing around hospice of, we'll meet you where you are, you're not in this alone. And along with text suggestions on this website, there's a lot of imagery options as well. We used to have in our brochures pictures of people holding hands like this, people sitting looking at a sunset on a beach, black and white photos of people looking kind of like a serious, sad conversation. And we have learned through a lot of marketing research that that does not resonate with people. That doesn't look like a good time and something that I want to do. And if you were to use, if you think about it, like the millions of dollar marketing budget that large pharmaceutical companies have, and they run these TV ads for like cancer drugs, but the people are riding their bikes and having a good time, and like they are living their life, and that looks like approachable and something that I would do. So it doesn't need to look cheesy and like a lot of stock photography if somebody's having the best time, but if it's a picture of two people in conversation, Neutral tends to read as negative for people. It's got to be a little on the positive side for somebody to say, like, yeah, this looks good. I want to do that thing. Or these people don't look like they're having a hard time with it. I think I could do that too. So this website has a lot of really helpful imagery there. And some of the messaging prompts to remember is this idea of talking up the benefits. These are services that can improve people's lives. You don't need to start with death and dying, because that's going to turn a lot of people off. This is about how you can live your life well. Presenting choices at every step. There should never be there's nothing more I can do for you, Mrs. Jones, or we can't do anything more for your father. There may not be curative solutions right now, but there's always something we can be offering for comfort, and you can always have a say in that. That using stories and aspirational stories where things are going well. Look at this time where somebody did talk about it and it worked for them, rather than a lot of statistics. My original slides, like 10 years ago, was 8 pages of statistics telling you how few people had conversations. And that is also anchoring people to, like, people don't do this, as opposed to look at these examples and stories of where people have. So stories can make a really big difference for that. Making sure that we're inviting dialogue, not just once. This is, again, something that people can change what their wishes are. We're asking them to think about it. We're hosting events every National Healthcare Decisions Day. Let's normalize this regularly. And that there's a new team that we are invoking that's not just the clinicians, it's the patients, it's their families, their caregivers, community groups. The folks at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit did an event with clergy of all different denominations and clinicians who were getting together, and the clinicians presented to the clergy, here's what I wish you would know about end-of-life issues that come up regularly, and what do you need to know about brain death, and what does a feeding tube look like. And then they changed seats, and the clergy got up and said, here's what I need you to know about our faith, and what are the common things, and what to be aware of. We know that a lot of people who maybe haven't been the most religious in their life, but they return to their faith towards the end of life because they realize, I don't want to make a decision that the Catholic Church doesn't allow, or is my rabbi going to say about this? And so it can be really important to have this team that includes the others that are well respected and part of someone's life. And again, who those messengers are of this can be really important. And I mentioned clergy a lot, or congregations, but there's a lot of other community groups where employers can be really important in this, or different services in a community. And especially being here in Howard County and Columbia, where there's so many community services, it's amazing to see where that can play out. We received this great email from somebody talking as we move towards dementia, this idea of going to visit grandparents who had had a really hard time. They weren't willing to talk about this in the past. They wouldn't move. They wouldn't pick a proxy. And she looked at our resources on her flight over and said, I realized I needed to start asking questions and stop telling them what I was worried about. And in that visit, where it was much more question-based, they got to a better place, and she's now the proxy, and they're willing to move. And I think that a lot of this is, as we think about this with dementia, is preparing the individual who wants to bring up these conversations for what to expect and how this can go. To have walked the walk, it's a lot easier to bring this up and say, I've done this myself. I'm not only bringing this up with you, so think about it yourself, practice with others. Realize that you may have to keep this quick and simple and not to expect a really long conversation to play out. You may need to connect with others in this space. I know there's been some questions about what if the person with dementia reacts really negatively, or they think I'm trying to upset them. And this came up, it's in one of the, in your book, it's this one that says San Diego on the side. It's on the right-hand side. I love this page. Talking about how to really focus on the feelings that people are having and not needing to, let me see what I have here on one of the slides. There's a kind of an emotional reaction people can have, and if they're upset, you want to respond more to the feeling that they're experiencing, rather than trying to be like, well, we talked about this yesterday, and let me tell you again, and you have this disease, and let me make sure you understand it. It's not trying to convince them of something. You want to meet them where they are. That this is a kindness to be willing to be sure we're trying to honor what their wishes are, and that to be really careful, the concept of denial is not appropriate in this end of life, or in this dementia space, that it's really the changes in the brain can make it hard for somebody with dementia to understand the memory issues they're having, and you don't need to spend all of your time trying to convince them of what's going on, as opposed to helping them feel better as the conversation happens. And so some of the questions we suggest are similar in nature, but they may look different at the different stages of dementia. So early on, you may be able to have this conversation. An early stage in the disease, we can sit down, let's look at some of these scale questions together, really being careful not to negate the concerns they have, the feelings they have, what they're worried about. I love the idea of having the Legos and doing that. I've taken some ideas away from that. Maybe in a middle stage of dementia, you can't plan, I'm going to talk about this on Sunday, because maybe that's not going to be a good day, but there will be some good moments where you can get in there and have these conversations. But you're going to have to be quick about, like, what are the 1 to 2 things I really want to be sure I get out of this, because I'm not going to sit down and do really long conversation. And this later stage where perhaps it's more of a focus of remembering how this person lived their life. How do I think they would have answered these questions? Not how do I answer them for myself, or how would I wish they would answer them? Can I pull together other people who knew mom well, or other caregivers in our life, and let's all think about this together from her perspective. Really often how people live their life, they're telling you plenty about what their values are. Without getting too clinical, there are some questions that could start to prompt people of, if I get sick with another illness, how would I want you to approach that? And that can be an important one to bring up. And we have, again, a guide that's specifically for caregivers of somebody with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. But the opportunity there is for advocacy, of really sharing who this person is. In the last group, they were talking about a program for physicians or clinicians with dementia, and how to help their current clinicians realize, like, this was a former physician who trained medical students. Like, let me tell you who this person was in their life and how to make their wishes clear. And also to learn from others. There are so many caregiver groups, and it can be really helpful to hear what has been important for other people. I love this quote about a woman talking about at the end of life. My mother just loved watching birds on the bird feeder and was happy with grandkids and watching birds. And that tells you some of the things of, like, I don't want her in a room that's windowless in the center of a building. Or I want to be sure grandkids can still visit. And those are the concepts of what matters, because she's really quite content, and that's what the focus is now. And that was a real aha for somebody in the room who was like, oh, I need to add bird feeder to my list of what I want people to know, because I love birds. So learning from others. So my hope for you from today is, I didn't ask at the beginning how many of you have had this conversation, but that you might take a look at the guide, think through your own wishes, have this conversation with somebody in your life, either whose wishes you want to elicit from them, or you want to be sure to share your wishes. And that you could bring this what matters to me concept back to your sphere of influence, your personal life, your professional life, your community groups. How could you help normalize this for others? I'd say take out your phone right now. Won't be rude. Send a text. Somebody say, I'm going to see you this weekend, or we're going to get together for Easter. Or when I see you this summer, I want to talk to you about this thing, just so that it doesn't end up on the back burner later. April 16th, you'll think of me, and that can also be your excuse. And to close out, I just want to read to you a letter from a session like this. There was a woman who wrote a letter to her daughters. So you can see her handwriting here. And she says, if you're faced with a decision that you're not ready for, it's okay. I'll try to let you know what I would want for various circumstances. But if you come to something we haven't anticipated, it's okay. And if you come to a decision point and what you decide results in my death, it's okay. You don't need to worry that you've caused my death. You haven't. I will die because of my illness or my body failing or whatever. You don't need to feel responsible. Forgiveness is not required. But if you feel bad, responsible, guilty, first of all, don't. And second of all, you are loved and forgiven. If you're faced with a snap decision, don't panic. Choose comfort, choose home, choose less intervention, choose to be together at my side, holding my hand, singing, laughing, loving, celebrating, and carrying on. I will keep loving you and watching you and being proud of you. And as much as I just said, don't call something a gift, I'm going to say that's a gift from her to her children, to have in her handwriting, she's recorded it in her voice, to have a letter that says, if something you choose results in my death, you are not responsible. That was my body, and I'm also going to be clear of what I want for you. Like, that is a real... it's a real gift, and it's a form of communication that's not a sit-down conversation. For her, it was easier to write it down. For some people, it may be easier to send an email to say, I'd love to talk to you about this, but I just want you to be able to see what some of my thoughts are. You can pull this up when the time comes so that you don't feel alone. I want you to hear it in my voice. My mom was basically like, yeah, that. Like what she said. It's easier to sometimes say, can I send that exact letter to somebody? Yes, absolutely. So thinking about what is it that you would want your people to know. So with that, if you're interested, I mentioned we have a ton of community resources that I didn't talk about today, but sample sermons, ways that people are bringing this to employers, slide decks, notes, sample agendas for if you were to want to facilitate something in your community, a map of people all over and what they're doing. We're on social media. It's helpful hearing about health literacy and how not to expect that somebody is going to come to a website, download a PDF, print it out, and look through a lot of words. We know that's not going to be the best way to reach everybody, and we've been trying to do a lot more, especially on social media, of breaking things into little bite-sized pieces, 30-second videos, each question introduced in different ways, kind of a slow drip, to again normalize it all year round and to make the content feel much more accessible to people. So that's something that we're working on now. And to get more storytelling, people sharing their stories, working with influencers, having them talk to their followers in a really niche content area of how this applies to them.
You're on TikTok.
I know. I'm too addicted to social media as it is, and I personally could not handle going on TikTok.
More important than all the ones.
I know. Part of me was like, oh, if it gets shut down, I'll feel vindicated that I didn't put all my time into that one.
You sending these slides out to us?
Yes, so I'll send the slides. And so I'm just going to leave it open for questions. I know we start a little bit later. My email address is on here if you have any questions. That's also a QR code to get to the materials that we have. But if you have questions, stories, tips for us, ways you think would be helpful to get this out to more people, eager for it.